Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group, an independent energy market, policy, and geopolitical analysis firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. Mr. McNally is also a former energy advisor to President George W. Bush. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This podcast episode is brought to you by EPAC, the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada. Good afternoon, Mr. Bob McNally. Thank you very much for doing this. Again, I appreciate your time.
Trevor, it's great to be with you, and thanks for having me back.
For the listener, I recently read a good chunk of your book, Crude Volatility, which you sent me to
All
as
right,
well.
thank you.
So I wanted to say thanks for sending that on. It's a great read.
Well, thank you very much. It was a labor of love because it allowed me to indulge in my first love, which was history, and then my second love, which was energy. But I think hopefully you found the analysis relevant for today and sort of where things are going. But thank you very much. Really enjoyed writing that. And I want to shout out to my research assistant, Fernando Ferreira, who now is head of Rapidan's geopolitical risk service. So a very busy man. He is a great help on that book.
As a reminder to the listener, you are the CEO of Rapidan. But what is Rapidan?
So technically, I'm the president. My mother said from a little boy, I was always said I want to grow up to be president. So I'm president. We have a fabulous CEO. His name is Scott Modell. He's also been a busy guy because he, in a former life, was a CIA field officer, and a fluent Farsi speaker. So an Iran expert, among other things. But he's our CEO. I'm the president, and Rapidan is a 16-year-old energy market policy and geopolitical risk consulting firm. So I call it, MPG, not miles per gallon, markets, policy, and geopolitical risk. So we're a sell-side research and analysis firm. Don't advocate for policies one way or the other. What we do is help risk managers, whether it's short-term hedge funds or longer-term major oil companies and investors, to identify, evaluate, and incorporate an analysis of risk and opportunity emanating from fundamentals. So we do the supply demand analysis, the policy, regulatory, legal analysis for all energies, and then geopolitical risk, which has been extremely busy here in the last couple of weeks. So that's kind of the three core areas. We're clustered in Washington, D.C. and Houston, and we have plenty of material to work with and seeing a lot of growth.
It's not every day you get to talk to a former presidential energy advisor. So I thought we could structure that conversation today around some of those experiences and then get your thoughts on some current events, if that works for you.
You bet. You bet.
So to go back to your time in the White House, circa 2003 under George W. Bush, how did you get involved with George W. Bush and how did you meet him?
So I was very lucky. My opportunity sprang, as so much does in energy, from crisis. I had not worked in the Hill or as a lobbyist in D.C. I was in D.C., but didn't kind of climb the usual ladder. I met him because his first National Economic Council director is a man named Larry Lindsay, and Larry Lindsay and I knew each other. He helped my firm, Tudor Investment, understand central bank policy and so forth. And so, as you may recall, but you were probably too young, as President Bush was taking office, the country was in the midst of an electricity crisis, particularly in California. We're having blackouts every night. And so there was a need for urgent policy decisions, such as for the FERC, the National Electricity Regulator, to issue emergency orders and so forth, and try and help the Californians deal with these chronic crises. And there weren't many energy experts in Washington back then. And so knowing Larry, Larry was putting together his team on the National Economic Council. We had to make decisions right away. And so I happened to be in the right spot in the right place. And I was introduced to President Bush at the first meeting, literally the Monday morning after the Saturday inaugural, introduced to him as the guy who's going to fix the California electricity crisis, which was raising the bar a bit. And I was basically an oil market analyst, but I learned quickly. So I was lucky, really. I was at the right time at the right place, knew the right people, and they were looking eagerly to get energy advisors in place as fast as possible.
What year was that?
That was 2001. I mean, the administration started to take form in late December of 2000, won the election in November. The courts, you may recall, had litigated this. There was the hanging chads and everything. So in December, it was clarified the president had won, and it was early January 2001. And then I left after 2.5 years. And Trevor, they told us when we came in that whereas a president runs a 4-year marathon or 8-year marathon, his staff sprint. You work almost harder, right? And you can't sprint for as long as you run a marathon. And they told me that the lifespan of an advisor at my level, which was called special assistant to the president, was 18 months. So if you went, and he's trying to set expectations. Look, you're not going to be around here after 18 months. Well, I made it 2.5 years. And I had two jobs, one on the National Economic Council in charge of all domestic energy, the other at the National Security Council, all international energy. And this was a very busy time in domestic and international energy policy, from the Enron crisis to the California crisis that we talked about, Second Gulf War, 9/11, refilling the SPR. We did a major climate plan. We did a major energy policy plan. So it was a very busy time in domestic and international energy. And I was very grateful to be there then and to serve then and to serve for a man like George W. Bush.
So, as a special advisor to the president with a focus on energy, how does that work? Does he come to you with a list of questions, or is it vice versa? Do you have suggestions?
Well, it's a two-way flow, but the main job of the National Economic Council and the National Security Council is process. It's process. It's really to make sure that the departments and the agencies and the officials working throughout the sprawling bureaucracy are implementing the president's policies, right? Especially when you have a change of administration, a change of policy, but also that the president is benefiting from the advice and counsel of those departments. And to make sure that as a president gets ready to make a big decision, he or she has the benefit of the counsel and the advice fairly presented of all his relevant advisors. So DOE, State Department, Interior, EPA, depended on the issue. So our job was just to make sure there was a two-way flow. The president's directions were being implemented, his policies were being implemented, but also he was able to benefit from the advice of his advisors so he could make smart decisions, because we were the last stop really before he said or did something that's monumental. The president doesn't do anything that's really small. So that's kind of what the job entails if done right. It's not to push internally for a certain policy or so forth. It's to make sure there's a fair process so you can hear all views and make wise decisions.
So, on day one, when you guys sit down, do you each compare a bullet list of ideas, or is it kind of a one-way discussion with the president? You kind of said it's back and forth, but how does it start on day one?
So usually what happens is there's two kinds of meetings. There's informational, where the president wants a briefing on something and you're presenting a PowerPoint deck. We had them back then. And you're explaining what he would like to know. It could be, what does our electricity grid and supply and demand look like in early 2001? Or, we had oil prices spike in early 2001 because there was like a teeny little version, a proto version of OPEC plus. You had Mexico and Venezuela cooperating with Saudi Arabia, and they increased production. So if the president needs to understand something or be briefed on something, there's what we call an informational interview. And you submit a PowerPoint deck the night before to his staff secretary, and they make sure that thing is perfect. And then the president will, like a professor, he'll walk you through slide by slide. And he is very meticulous, very smart, asked really good questions. He always had a knack for asking questions that maybe you hadn't thought of. So you're always trying to think of, what's he going to ask me? What's he going to ask me? So I tell you, I think I do a pretty good job, but I was pretty nervous. And then the other kind of decision meetings would be decisional. Okay. So here's where the president has to make a decision. I'll give you an example. As part of the energy plan, one of the controversial things we had to do was decide whether to give the federal government eminent domain authority in terms of siting high power electricity lines. This came from California and so forth. Should Connecticut be able to block New York from siting and building electricity lines through to Long Island to help them deal with and avoid blackouts. Now, Republicans tend to not like to see heavy handed federal authority, and especially when it comes to taking private property. However, in this case, we thought they needed to have this authority. So, even though there was consensus, so pretty much everybody on the policy side agreed, because it was such a controversial decision and it could be unpopular, we took it to the president. And that's when you go and you brief the reasons for the policy, why you think it's necessary, and then either at that meeting or afterwards, he gives his judgment. Alternatively, Trevor, there could be a difference of opinion where we have to make a policy call and his advisors are divided. That's the tricky part. So that's where the process and being fair and objective comes in. That's where my job was to be okay, make sure I'm fairly and accurately representing the views of side A, side B, make sure the memo is fair and everything so the president gets to hear both sides and then make a decision. So decisional meetings and then informational meetings, they were always, a bit nerve-wracking, a bit exciting, stimulating, never boring. The president was really engaged. The vice president, Cheney, of course, very knowledgeable about energy, all his advisors. So it was not usually about some boring academic topic. It was usually some emergency or exciting issue of the day.
And so in the inevitable situation where you find yourself maybe disagreeing with the president, how does that work? How do you argue with the president?
Well, uh, tact and humor, and he wins. He gets to win all the policy debates. But there's a technique for you making sure the president understands your point of view if he's asking for it, or the point of view opposed to his decision. But, you read the room. When the president makes a final decision, everybody salutes and implements it. So, on those few occasions where I may wish to have, let's say, represented a view that was not the prevailing one, tact, humor, humility, respect, that's the way to do it with President Bush anyway. And he'll note your issue and your concern and then make his own decision. So you want to live to fight another day.
Did you find that sometimes it is valuable to stick up for your opinion and have a backbone and that sometimes leaders appreciate that feedback?
No question. No question. Matter of fact, you're asking, so I'll tell a little story. One of the things I'm most proud of for my time at my service was an issue that I really at first didn't want to have anything to do with. It came with, it concerned our car efficiency standards, what we call corporate average fuel economy standards, CAFE. Okay. And before we took office, Congress had frozen CAFE and there was no legislation. And one of the things President Bush wanted to do was to unfreeze it, consider the latest science, and re-implement them. So this is something usually Democrats do, but a Republican president wanted to do it. But the National Academy of Sciences in the United States came out with a report early in the administration concluding something that conservatives have asserted for years, which is that cafe regulations, the way they used to be structured, inadvertently killed people and injured people because they encouraged automakers to downsize and downweight their vehicles. And what you saw was the car makers were making lighter and smaller cars, selling those at a loss to people of lower income so that they could make money on the heavier SUVs and still meet the average fuel economy standards. And so we were literally, Trevor, trading blood for oil. And when I read this report, I really wished I had nothing to do with cafe. I find it very boring. However, when I saw this report, I became energized. And there were others in the administration that said, look, let's just raise cafe. Let's just forget that report. Let's just increase the standard a little bit. We'll use it as a bargaining chip with the Democrats and we'll get, and I said, absolutely not. And I led the charge to insist that we reform, not raise cafe.
Mm.
And I became a bit, kinda, you might say, I don't wanna say over the top, but I made sure that that view was represented all the way to the president and in Congress, and I made it a kind of personal mission of mine to not allow this deadly cafe to be raised, which now the National Academy of Sciences agreed with us. So this is not a bunch of Republican lobbyists. Okay. And we did. We reformed it. And there was disgruntlement among some of my peers. I forced us to take a lot of time and effort, but In the end, when I look back at my time there, ironically, the thing that, and we had a lot of exciting things going on, the thing that I initially was less excited about turned out to be the thing I'm most proud of, and in a way is really the most moral thing I did, is I think we literally saved lives. And so we changed Cafe to where we eliminate that downsizing and downweighting compliance option by going to vehicle attribute. We can talk about it offline sometime. You can read about it. So you can say it may not be as effective as the old system was as saving fuel, but it's a lot more effective at saving lives. And for me, that's a good trade.
From the outside looking in, it would appear that one of the main policy levers in the administration is gas prices, supply and demand of US oil production, which sometimes is at odds between at the pump gas prices and industry. Did you ever find there was a tension between those two sides of the coin? And how did you think about that?
Oh, yes, we certainly did. We learned what every president learns and all presidential staff learned, and that is few things terrify an American president more than a price spike at the pump, whatever the reason. It's really binary. Either see that officials tend to just ignore energy, or they're panicked about it because prices are high. There's two modes. And you have to explain a hard truth to the president and his staff, and that is that the president has very little power over gasoline prices in the short term. There aren't really any tools in the toolbox. The best tool is called a phone, and you use the phone to call Riyadh and UAE and countries that have spare capacity, and you say, "Would you pretty please produce some more oil?" That's the best. It's a phone call. And after that, spilling the SPR, dropping the bucket, irresponsible, especially when used just to try and influence oil prices. Irresponsible because then you have less protection if there's a real supply emergency. Threatening to sue or investigate oil companies. It's been done since 1917. They've threatened this and investigated. They never find anything. That's just hand waving and smoke blowing to distract. There really aren't really good options when it comes to short term oil prices. So the president has to really, one thing you learn in government is half the battle is implementing good policies. The other half of the battle is avoiding bad policies. Don't do stupid things. And that takes up a surprisingly a large amount of time. That is one thing I'll say I learned from going in the administration as opposed to observing how much time is spent stopping dumb ideas. And a lot of dumb ideas happen when gasoline prices go up.
For the listener, why is there a tension between low oil prices and industry? Maybe just in a nutshell, what is that tension?
So the issue is just this: shale oil requires a higher price than other forms of crude production to be profitable, period.
Mhm.
Our shale industry needs to see 60 or so dollars a barrel minimum to really be drilling and fracking new wells. And it needs to see 30 to 40 to avoid shutting in existing wells. And that's considerably higher from a production cost perspective than other crude production. And so that means that when crude oil prices fall below $60 a barrel or so, shale oil is the collateral damage. Shale oil takes it on the chin. It's shale oil that is first to see diminished activity. So, as wonderful as American shale oil and gas is, in the case of shale oil, it is relatively high cost and it is more responsive to price, right? Shale producers are going to be more nimble and more responsive to price than, say, Guyana. Guyana's not going to turn off those wells, whether the price of oil goes to $5 a barrel or $105 a barrel. But shale oil producer, look at, for example, in 2020, when crude oil prices collapsed from $60 a barrel to, they averaged at the 20s, but then we had negative $37 a barrel, you may recall there for the May contract in 2020 for a brief period of time. So effectively zero. We lost 2.5 million barrels a day of US crude production in a matter of months. So very, very responsive, and we take it on the chin because we're higher cost and flexible. We're more elastic or responsive to price than other forms of crude production, conventional crude production.
In a nutshell, at times when oil prices go down, it's hard on the energy sector, but it can be good for the consumer, maybe is a simple way to explain it.
There you go. That's exactly right. And conversely, when oil prices go up, you get more investment, but the consumer hurts. The Goldilocks is to have a stable price that is comfortable for producers, that rewards and encourages adequate investment in new energy while meeting consumer and industry demands for energy at an affordable price. So it's that sweet spot, discerning it and then attempting to maintain stability. And that's really what the thesis of my book was all about. In some ways, the history of the oil market. And there was an old book in the 30s that with this title is all about a quest for stability. Quest for stability. And I think to your point, maybe to say a quest for stability at a price consumers and producers can live with.
The term is called a swing producer, which maybe we'll get into in a sec. But before we do, the question I had is when you're advising the president on energy policy, how does that work in terms of your day to day? Do you live at the White House or do you commute? What is that like?
Well, sometimes you feel like my wife felt that I lived at the White House, but technically I went home just about every night. No, I lived in the suburbs. You commute in and you have a parking spot there right next to the White House. And I had an office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, that big Victorian kind of looking building next door to the White House. A pass, you can go into the West Wing at any time. And, a lot revolved around whether you were heading to brief the president or not. Usually that was on your schedule, so that would drive a lot of your process and preparation. But there would be morning meetings every morning in the West Wing with the National Economic Council, and depending on what was happening, the National Security Council, the sit room, and so forth. So you're basically in the West Wing, you're in that Eisenhower building, you're back and forth. Occasional trips, not too many, one to the Gulf of Mexico, one to represent the U.S. at the International Energy Agency in February of 2003, just before we liberated Iraq. So that was kind of my main diplomatic mission. But no, most of the time is spent in and around the White House complex. A few trips up to the hill here and there, but most of the time you're living in the White House complex. But I got to go home most nights.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's trusted leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance, pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. JSG proudly supports Canada's energy infrastructure with competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources. Visit jsginc.com for more information. Okay, to get to some current events, the concept of the swing producer, which is roughly what your book, Crude Volatility, is about. What is a swing producer and how does that affect day-to-day oil prices?
Great. So a swing producer is a company, or really more likely a country and a group of countries that are willing to do something that a normal oil company would never do and is unable to do. And that is to adjust his or her production up or down quickly. Normal crude producers never do that. When you spend all that capex up front finding, developing, and transporting that crude, you want to earn a return. Your operating costs are low. You're going to run that field as hard as you can. And only if there's an accident or a need for a storm or a need for workovers would you temporarily stop. Otherwise, you're always going 100%. That's what your investors want. That's what your government wants. That's what you want. That's the problem, though, from maintaining price stability. So, what a swing producer does is step in and say, we're going to do things a little differently. We are able and willing to increase or decrease our crude wellhead production with the goal of keeping the oil market globally stabilized. Now, to try to swing for that fence, you've got to be a big producer. You have to have cheap wells that you have the ability to cycle up and down on, right? And in history, that is what we've seen. In the beginning, it was the state of Texas, regulated by the Texas Railroad Commission and other major oil states. They had regulators who would meet every month and set quotas, driller by driller, well by well, field by field, for 40 years. And as I point out in my book, at one time, between the U.S. oil states and then the Seven Sisters, the major oil companies, international major oil companies that cooperated with the Railroad Commission in keeping prices stable around the world, they held one-third of world oil production in spare in the early 1950s. Imagine any commodity where regulators will force a shutdown of one-third of production capacity to keep oil prices stable, especially a commodity as important as oil. I can't think of one. But they did that for oil because the Texans learned the hard way. If you don't control this beast, the volatility will kill you. So Texas and the Seven Sisters were eventually replaced by OPEC. And OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, became the new effective, and I want to use a key word here, Trevor, durable swing producer. Durable. Lasted for decades. That's important because during other boom-bust eras when we had no swing producer, you would see these temporary pop-up cartels form. It was natural because especially when oil prices collapsed, the producers would be terrified and they get together and say, we either hang together and agree to limit production or we're going to hang separately. Mm-hmm. The first I point out in the book was a group called the Oil Creek Association, like 1861, 1860, during our American Civil War. But these temporary cartels ultimately failed because there was excess production from outside their group. New oil was coming on. They couldn't control that. And then cheating started within. But there had been only two sort of conventional swing producers that have been successful on a durable basis. And that is the Texas Railroad Commission-led system from 1932 to 1972, and then OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, from 1972 until, in my view, 2008. The reason, Trevor, we're seeing an unusual range in oil prices in the last 20 years, up to above 140, down to shut-in levels in the 20s, without wars, without recessions, and even sometimes, the reason for that is we don't have a durable swing producer. We have OPEC Plus, and it has had moments of great success, like right now. It's doing a great job at keeping the price stable. But it has had its moments where it hasn't worked, and you've seen the fighting and failure, 2020 most spectacularly. So I think the jury is still out as to whether OPEC Plus will become history's third durable, successful swing producer. That we'll see. They have their good times, they have their bad times. But OPEC and Texas, for 4 decades, did a darn good job at keeping oil prices fairly stable. But you need that swing producer because we found it's the only tool that we have that can counteract the natural tendency of oil prices to swing wildly, to go through these boom and bust cycles.
Top-down economic policy and price dictations are kind of contrary to the free market capitalist system in the West. How do you think that kind of two arguments is settled in the West, or is it just necessary to have that cartel activity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great tension. And, I tell folks that, in my view, I'm from Connecticut, but I work for a Texan president. I have a lot of clients in Texas. I was in Texas last week. Earlier this week, I go to Texas all the time. And I love Texans and Oklahomans for that matter. And you may ask yourself, not to get religious, but why did God make Texans? And in my view, God put Texans on earth to limit government's role in setting business decisions and to produce oil and gas. Same thing for our Oklahoman friends. And God bless them for it. I think that's just awesome. However, consider the irony that it was Texans who resorted to some of the most heavy-handed government control of any economic activity, let alone one as important as oil. Mm-hmm. Those 3 Texas railroad commissioners, starting in 1932, met every month. And as I said, they slapped quotas backed by the police power of a state on private businessmen and women. telling them how much they could produce of their own oil. I tell folks, Mao Zedong would have been embarrassed at how heavy-handed the Texans were practicing, let's call it communism or central planning. Let's call it what it is. Let's be honest. And I think, others have noticed this. The governor of Texas, I have a quote in my book where the governor of Texas in the beginning addresses this. He said, look, I used to think government intervention in markets was improper, but I've come to think differently. So because oil is the lifeblood of modern civilization, because oil prices are prone to wild boom and bust price swings, the only thing worse than regulating supply is not regulating supply and having to live with that price volatility. That's what history shows. That's what the economics of oil shows. It showed it to President Trump. Look what happened in 2020 when COVID hit. We lost about 20% of world demand in a few weeks. Saudi Arabia and Russia refused to join in with its partners in cutting. And so we had not only a failure to cut, but everybody in OPEC sort of stepped on the gas and produced all they could. So two black swans hit the oil market. And we fell from 60 to 20, and at one point negative $37 in WTI in a matter of months. So what did President Trump do? Well, at first he loved it, right? The ride from $60 to $40 a barrel is awesome for an American president. Gasoline prices are falling from $4 to $2 a gallon. Everyone's getting a tax cut, consumer confidence, everyone's loving it. But as we go below 30 into the 20s and then the 10s and the zeros, then we start to see shut-ins of oil production. As I said, we lost 2.5 million barrels a day in a few months. And it got so bad that, the Texas Railroad Commission was reconsidering putting quotas back in. They had abandoned that in 1972. I happen to have been a expert witness. I didn't argue for either side. I just provided analytical perspective in a 2-day virtual hearing because it was COVID back then. And you had President Trump now terrified that the American energy dominance is going away. It's falling apart in front of his eyes. So working with my friend Dan Briette, then the energy secretary, President Trump's did something an American president normally never does. American presidents, when they call OPEC, it's always to ask for more oil to get oil prices lower. But this time, President Trump called OPEC plus Saudi Arabia and Russia and said, you guys got to cut out your fighting, get together, and cut supply to raise prices. That never has happened before and hasn't happened since. And the reason is the president realized that hard truth that the Texans learned in the early 1930s, that the only thing worse than, supply management is no supply management, because when you get those busts, it kills your oil sector. And, it's all the more important for President Trump because if you read his books and everything before he became president, right up there with kind of excoriating China and its trade practices, he really hated OPEC. If you read his book, dripping with hatred for OPEC and supply control and price manipulation, et cetera, wanted to sue OPEC. Well, he won an OPEC Achievement Award in 2020. He became like the hero of art of the deal. And so again, I think there's another recent example of that tension and that sort of comfort or recognition or, resignation that free market Republican business people, especially, have to make when it comes to oil supply. A little bit of central planning, unfortunately, is better than the alternative.
To think of it from the other side without intervention, what do you think would have happened if there wasn't intervention? The argument is that eventually the markets will take care of themselves, but what do you think?
I think it would have been intolerable had there been no supply control and consumers and businesses had to absorb price swings, you know, $4.50, $5 a gallon, and then down to $1 a gallon. This would be so disruptive for monetary policy, for industry. I mean, these are long-lived investments in airplanes and cars and production lines and things. If you think oil is going to be $50 a barrel, you design certain and build certain kind of planes and certain kind of cars because that's what people will want. If it's 150, you design completely different, and you can't change that every few years. So, in my view, society wouldn't have tolerated the price volatility. And if we didn't have that swing producer, let's call it upstream on the crude, you would have had, and this is what I get to my point about being worse policies, demand for intervention. There would be demand to release strategic stocks, even if there wasn't a geopolitical emergency. That wouldn't work. And then we'd be out of strategic stocks. Price controls. You will see politicians come in and try to regulate domestic prices at home. You see a little bit of that in California today. That won't work. Price controls are disastrous, as we learned in the 1970s. And so, really, I think if we didn't have successful supply management and price stabilization, you would see panicked bad policies that would make the problem worse.
Like the depression, sort of the boom bust free market era where things got really bad. But when things get super bad in the economy, sometimes that's where the seeds of really bad policies are planted, like socialism and communism too. So,
That's right. I think you're right. Crises can be generators of good policy and bad policy. I think both often can flow from crises, and you could argue that the Second World War was a undoubtedly a crisis, but it sort of got the United States to realize it has to shed isolationism and adopt a global sort of leadership role. That wasn't obvious before Pearl Harbor, but the 1970s example of how price volatility, especially for oil, inflation led to terrible policies. Both parties, by the way, Republicans and Democrats, price controls, subsidies, policies that were at least then, rejected. So you're right. Crises can birth good and bad policy.
nowadays, what to you is good energy policy? If you were to say this is working, would it be US energy industry becoming the swing producer? Would it be a bit of OPEC? What would be ideal for you?
Well, there's a lot there. The older I get, I have to say, Trevor, the more libertarian I become and less enamored of government intervention. Not that I really was even 20 years ago, but less is more. I think we need to get permitting reform for all forms of energy. Just ridiculous. The permitting, I think everyone realizes that there's some low hanging fruit. We've got to make it faster and easier to permit energy, especially the grid with AI coming and the increase in electricity demand. We've just got to do that. I'm an oil guy, but I'm very worried about our electricity grid. Reserve margins, quote unquote, spare capacity is low, and unlike oil, there's no real mass storage for electricity.
Mhm.
And so you get these low reserve margins, low tight capacity, low capacity grids, and now suddenly an outward shift in the demand curve for electrons through hyperscalers. No bueno. We gotta fix that, and part of it is reform. I think we have to get climate change policy right. Now, that's probably a view for maybe another whole podcast, but I've written on this. I chaired a group of former policy officials under Forum for American Leadership, and we came up with a blueprint for a sound and serious climate policy. And so that's probably more than we can chew here. But I think it's not to run away or ignore the externality of climate change, but it is to sort of burn to the ground the terrible policy structure we have right now, make sure we're accurately interpreting the science, looking at all strategies, evaluating cost benefit analyses, and then not tilting the forecasts toward wishful thinking, and then having legislation and not regulation, because this is ping pong, Trevor. You can't. Energy needs certainty. Whatever we do, we need certainty. And when you have a Republican president comes in and he burns everything down, and then a Democrat comes in and he starts to slap everything back on, and we go back and forth, not good for energy. So we need a sound and serious climate policy. We need to get permitting reform. We need to let a space and hope that OPEC Plus does its job and does it well. I know that's crazy to say in Washington. It doesn't make me very popular, but it's just the truth. And we learn it over and over again. And so we ought to, I think, be more respectful, frankly, for the role Saudi Arabia, UAE are playing in, because remember, these guys, when they reduce production, they're surrendering their own market share to their competitors to keep oil prices stable for everybody. Now, it's in their interest, but it's also in our interest. So I think we've gotten pretty good. Demonizing OPEC is not a smart idea. We've got to refill the SPR. I know there's a healthy debate, even in the right and the left, about whether we need an SPR, Strategic Petroleum Reserve, now that the United States is an exporter. If so, how big? Perhaps another podcast discussion. In my view, we certainly do need it. As long as oil prices are volatile, the world is a dangerous place, and most of the spare capacity, our reserve buffer, is in the Arabian Gulf. We're going to need it. And one of the good reasons for a strong SPR is because if there's not a positive tool like that to use in emergencies, presidents will resort to worse things. Another bad policy, by the way, restricting exports. I'm very concerned about that. We saw it at the end of the Biden administration, limits on LNG permitting. Really bad idea. The left wants to restrict exports of oil and gas. They see it as a way to reduce investment in oil and gas, and they're right. But what I'm afraid of, going back to your question about high oil prices, if we get high oil prices and the president has no tools whatever, we don't like OPEC, we sold off our SPR, you'll see a resort to export restrictions. And that would be disastrous for investment in shale, oil and gas, and for global price stability. So I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit that we can pluck as a country, and I hope we will.
This episode is brought to you by Astro Oilfield Rentals. Distance can elevate risk, be it equipment failure, cash burn, or threats to your reputation. Astro Oilfield Rentals can help minimize those risks for you. With an impressive fleet of well-site trailers, cutting-edge communications equipment, expert technicians, and round-the-clock diagnostics, Astro ensures your remote operations stay productive from the U.S. border to the Arctic Circle. Astro Oilfield Rentals is there for you no matter the mile. Learn more at astrorentals.ca. Do you think that the OPEC has the spare capacity?
A little bit. The problem is it's all in the Arabian Gulf, and we just went through
Yeah.
a fire drill on that. Saudi Arabia probably has around 3 million barrels a day or so. UAE, a million or so, a few other dribs and drabs there. So depending on who you believe and what numbers, 4 to 6 million barrels a day, maybe. And that's a pretty good amount. The problem is it's all behind the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not a terrible amount. It's a pretty good amount. But I think going forward, that spare capacity is going to go down. I don't believe in this peak demand stuff. I know it's very fashionable, but we see no evidence at Rapidan. We analyze the policy, we analyze the EV, we analyze current fuel demand and the leading indicators we'd expect to see if peak demand were real, and it's not. So the world's going to wake up and realize that demand's not going to peak. We are having weak demand because of weak economic conditions, but we're going to wake up and realize peak demand's wishful thinking, and then we're not investing enough, I think, to meet demand for oil and gas in the future at stable prices. So I'm still a kind of a medium term, very big bull on oil prices. And in that environment, we'll see kind of what happened to the Texas Railroad Commission in the late 60s and early 70s. What happens is if you don't invest enough, you don't have enough spare, as demand grows, you lose your spare, you increase production, you try and contain oil prices, try and contain them at 100, contain them at 110, but you run out of spare. That's what happened to Texas in 1972. That's what happened to Saudi Arabia in 2008. And that's what's going to happen to Saudi Arabia and UAE, I believe, later this decade.
Or you look up north to your quiet neighbor in Canada, maybe.
A great neighbor and should not be treated shabbily, in my view. I tell the story you asked about the White House. I felt especially both proud of Canada and a little embarrassed as an American when we failed to, I think, demonstrate right away our thanks to Newfoundlanders and other Canadians who welcomed flights that had to land suddenly after 9/11. And I had in my table in the White House, my White House office, a picture book of Canada after 9/11, just a book explaining and showing all the great things Canada did. So Canada is a great friend and ally of the United States and a natural energy partner. And any political interference in that, whether it's Keystone XL or threatened tariffs on imports, is self-harming for the United States, ridiculous. And I understand why many Canadians think, forget it. We're going to go to Tidewater here. We're going to Asia. We're going to build, even Quebec may allow, you tell me, allow you to build pipelines east. I understand why Canada is sort of shocked and dismayed. And I hope that doesn't last too much longer. And I hope we get back to our senses because Canada and the United States fit together like a glove in terms of our complementary energy resources and demand and infrastructure. And we should be building on it and protecting it and celebrating it, not denigrating it or weakening it, in my view. Hope I made myself clear on that one. I don't beat around the bush on that.
And feelings aside, Canada, it's a fact, has some of the biggest hydrocarbon reserves in the world. Do you think that American policymakers and energy companies realize that? Is that a well-known fact?
Most of them do. I want to be careful here. Most of them do. I think the vast majority of knowledgeable elected officials who have a sort of a basic understanding of energy realities and endowment of hydrocarbon resources
Just a fact.
understand Canada. I will say, I remember, funny, you mentioned you were asking some history. I remember going into one of my first meetings with President Bush was on the oil market. I think it was when those prices were going up. And my deputy director, Mark Summerlin, great guy. As we're walking in, he's like, make sure you know how much we import from Canada. And I like, what? Why? What? I mean, okay, but and the first question President Bush asked me is, how much are we getting from Canada? It was like we were a little worried, a little concerned, and the first thing he asked was, okay, what are we getting from Canada now? So, sometimes with energy, you don't focus on it and appreciate it until you're in a crisis. But when we get into a crisis, believe me, and so folks start counting where the United States gets its oil, how much and where, and whether that's secure oil. Canada's right up there, and if people are relieved, and folks are relieved that we are such a big partner with Canada.
It's in the interests of the US. It's a friendly neighbor to buy
Of course
things.
it is. Of course it is. We're going to get beyond this. I hope. We're just hopefully going to put this behind us and hopefully pretend it never happened. Hopefully.
Especially with tension in the Middle East. What do you suggest to policymakers in this sort of environment when you don't know what's going to happen?
Well, it's very uncertain, and here I have to personally, I think, commend President Trump. I think no other president would have had the courage to conduct the strike on Fordo to help the Israelis finish the job and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So I think that's a very brave decision. That, of course, put at risk the energy supplies from Hormuz. 20% of world supply comes from that region. Same thing with traded LNG. However, the president, so far anyway, has correctly bet that the Iranians wouldn't want to try and disrupt that traffic. And indeed, if there's one thing all of the belligerents, the United States, Israel, and Iran agree on so far is that we ought to not touch and attack facilities that deal with traded energy, whether it's crude, refined products, or LNG. Those are off limits. There have been hits on domestic refineries and terminals and things, but not. And so that's, I think, some shred. I mean, I don't call it a silver lining on the cloud, but I think also though people have to consider is President Trump is also probably the only president who could do a big deal with Tehran.
Mhm.
And I think that's something interesting to consider. I wouldn't say it's our base case, it's not, but there is a solid 20, 30% possibility that the Iranian regime will conclude its best option, having been severely degraded here and backed into a corner, it's defenseless, really, that its best option is to do a deal with President Trump, concede enrichment, allow intrusive inspections, but then get sanctions off. I wouldn't be surprised President Trump would go to Tehran, cut the ribbon on an embassy, do a Boeing order. It's a moment of both high risk but high opportunity. And if Iran makes the right decisions in whatever government it's going to have, let's see. But things don't necessarily always have to turn out for the worst. It could go for the better here. So definitely for folks like me involved in energy security and oil markets and gas markets, this has been quite a year so far.
Another concern is that China funds Iran with the purchase of hydrocarbons, which Trump allows. How does that work?
Well, again, President Trump and President Biden, you saw this with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. While the United States, both parties are eager and active employers of sanctions policies, when it comes to imposing sanctions that would drive down the supply of crude oil in the global oil market and therefore raise global crude oil and therefore domestic pump prices, they usually step back. In 2022, when oil prices soared from $80 to $120 a barrel, we had record high gasoline prices at that time in the United States. President Biden made sure to design this price cap sanction, which basically was a safety valve that allowed Russia to keep exporting, although it went all went to India, but tried to limit the revenue that Russia was earning from those barrels, but keep the barrels flowing. Otherwise, you shoot yourself in the foot because you cut off the oil, the price of oil goes up, and then political support for the sanction would go down. Similarly, at the end of his term, President Biden kind of looked the other way while Iran basically increased its oil exports to 1.5 million barrels a day plus, almost all of which went to China. So with Russia and Iran, you see the Biden administration having put in place flexible policies that kept that oil flowing. President Trump is probably continuing that. You may have seen in Canada, right around the corner there was a G7 meeting recently, and on the agenda, the Europeans wanted to lower this price cap sanction on Russia from $60 to $45 a barrel. That got blown up when Iran started. So we're not going to do anything that raises the price of oil. And as you've seen in public comments recently, President Trump seems to be okay with Iran continuing to export that oil to China. So that could be leverage over China, but also presidents learned that oil flowing helps keep oil prices low. And if there's one priority President Trump has right now, it's low oil prices.
So the benefits of having a lower oil price outweigh the cons of funding a bit of Iranian revenues in a
That's
nutshell.
right. That's the call. That's been the trade-off.
It's a
Yep.
complex problem, though, with no easy answers.
I will say though, during the first term, see, it depends on the environment you're in. In the first term, President Trump was able to sanction Iranian oil exports to almost zero. But that's back when we were in more of a bust phase where oil prices were lower and shale oil production was higher. And we were able to avoid a big price spike. The problem is now shale oil is sort of flat, spare capacity is down a little bit. We have other wars going on in this environment, trying to repeat that in Trump 1.0, because he did it in 1.0. Repeating it now would probably put upper pressure on oil prices.
It's easy to put your hand on certain issues and try and control the markets and play the intermediary. But do you think those actions are beneficial in the end, or how have you learned to think about that?
I think that's the role of a US president in this world. I think President Trump in that first term, when WTI was negative 37, the Texas Railroad Commission is getting ready to slap quotas on, and US shale production's nosediving. You got to change your view. I suddenly went from hating OPEC to love OPEC and start working the phones and get a deal done. President Obama, to his credit, he saw that shale oil production coming. We were getting ready to sanction Iran. And we had that export ban, that crude oil export ban, which threatened shale oil production. Remember, you had WTI Brent $25-$30 spread. And to his credit, he was like, we gotta work a deal with the Republicans here, but this is for energy security, for sanctioning Iran. We need to protect this shale oil production. Back then we believed in all of the above, right? And so presidents got to kind of intervene. And what President Trump recently did with Iran, I think, so far has been masterful. He really went the last mile for a deal, trying to convince Iran to step back from a nuclear weapons capability diplomatically. And he's still trying to do that. But when they refused and the moment came, he didn't shirk from the use of targeted military force to accomplish it. So, yeah, successful presidents have to dive in, take risk, and mediate, and use all the tools, and try to avoid disaster and encourage stability and growth. It's a tough job.
Very tough job and tough environment to give policy advice on. But I really appreciate your time today. Maybe if we were to wrap up the conversation, what message would you leave for energy policy makers heading into the summer, given what we've talked about, or the listener in general?
Yeah. So I really hope that they will see silver linings and lessons in some of the misfortune and near misses we've all experienced, from Spain's blackouts, Spain and Portugal, their blackouts, to the warnings we're getting from the electricity authorities about the grid getting too stressed, to the folly of selling down the Strategic Petroleum Reserve when we came close there to risking the loss of Hormuz flows, to the need for permitting reform, especially as we all focus on AI and the build out in gas, especially, and renewables that can come from that, but that we can't deploy it successfully if we don't get permitting reform. So I'm just hopeful that, we talked earlier, Trevor, you put it really well, that crises can lead to bad energy policy or bad policy. They can also lead to good policies. They can also cause folks to set aside bad policies. President Carter, at the end of his term, when it was so clear that his Iran policy had failed and Russia's invading Afghanistan and oil prices were high and price controls had failed to bring stability and were hurting production, even he, toward the end, starting to deregulate natural gas and started to implement, he started what became CENTCOM and the Rapid Deployment Force and the, U.S. kind of protectorate role in the Gulf. So I guess I'm a believer, and this is what I would hope, that policymakers, as we go through this mayhem, that they will avoid making the bad mistakes, bad policy, try to focus on fixing the problems we can fix that are maybe illuminated by these crises. And I'm cautiously optimistic that, it won't be a linear process, but that we can get it done.
Especially in the era of the AI arms race, of which a direct input is energy to
Right.
fuel it.
Right.
It's wise to consider that.
Absolutely. That's right, Trevor. Thank you very much for having me on your awesome podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.